Am I the a-hole for leaving my husband at the hospital after he refused to be in the delivery room with me? This happened 2 months ago, but it's still causing major friction in my family, so I need some outside opinions. I, 29 female, and my husband, Jake, 32 male, have been together for 6 years, married for 3. We were both ecstatic when we found out we were expecting our first child. Pregnancy was tough for me though. I had severe morning sickness, gestational diabetes, and was generally miserable. But Jake was supportive and sweet the whole way through, which made it bearable. As we got closer to my due date, we discussed birth plans. I was adamant that I wanted Jake in the delivery room. I needed his support and he'd always agreed. However, a few weeks before my due date, Jake started acting strange. He was distant, distracted, and wouldn't engage in any baby-related discussions. I thought he was just anxious about becoming a dad, so I didn't press him too much. The day I went into labor, Jake drove me to the hospital but seemed off. He was quiet and kept checking his phone. When we got there, he pulled the nurse aside and spoke to her privately. She came back and told me Jake wouldn't be in the delivery room because he was uncomfortable with blood and medical procedures. I was willing to at least present an argument for homeboy if he went up to his wife and was like, hey, I don't want to see this. It makes me uncomfortable because X, Y, and Z. Can we figure it out? But when he's such a coward that he goes up to the goddamn nurse and makes the nurse break the news to her while she's already in labor about to have the kid. Coward. I was stunned. He never mentioned this before. I begged him to stay, told him I needed him, but he just kept saying, I can't do this. I was heartbroken and furious, but I didn't have much time to dwell on it as my contractions were getting stronger. Jake said he'd be in the waiting room and kissed me on the forehead before leaving. I was left alone, crying and feeling utterly abandoned. The other thing that I did not address is this is very suspicious activity. Borderline somewhat guilty, as if maybe he did something, maybe he cheated, maybe he doesn't want to be a part of the baby's life anymore. This just seems very suspect to me. Labor was long, painful, and traumatic. I was alone the entire time except for the medical staff. When our son was finally born, I was exhausted emotionally and physically. The nurse handed me my son, and all I felt was a deep sadness that Jake wasn't there to share this moment. After I was taken to a recovery room, I asked the nurse to get Jake. She came back and said he'd left the hospital hours ago. Bitch, what happened to you being in the fucking waiting room? There's some hanky-panky going on, bro. If you're leaving while your actual child is being born, there's something happening. I couldn't believe it. I called him repeatedly, but he didn't answer. Finally, I sent him a text saying I was done and he could find his own way home. I didn't see him until the next day. He showed up at the hospital with flowers and an apology, saying he'd panicked and needed some air. He claimed he'd gone home to shower and change and fell asleep, which I didn't buy for a second. Good girl, I don't buy it either. Bro's lying. Liar, liar, pants for hire. I told him I didn't believe him. I was overwhelmed with anger and hurt, and I told him he had let me down in the worst way possible. He kept apologizing, saying he knew he'd messed up and he'd do anything to make it right. I didn't want him near me or our son at that moment, so I asked him to leave. He tried to protest, but I told him I needed time to process everything. He left and I spent the rest of my hospital stay alone with my baby, trying to grapple with the enormity of what had happened. Since then, Jake has been trying to make amends. He's been taking parenting classes, attending therapy, and is constantly trying to be present and supportive. But I can't shake the feeling of betrayal. He abandoned me at one of the most vulnerable moments of my life. Every time I look at him, I remember being alone in that delivery room, terrified and in pain, wondering why the person who had promised to be by my side wasn't there. Chat, I never know how to feel about these types of gestures. Like, on one hand, I think it can be very genuine, but on the other, it's like, bro, if you would have just shown up or at least communicated with your wife, you wouldn't even have to do that. It just feels like too little, too late. My family is split. Some think I'm being too hard on Jake, that he made a mistake and is clearly remorseful. They say he's a good father and partner otherwise, and I should focus on moving forward for the sake of our child. Others think what he did was unforgivable and I should leave him. They believe I'll never truly trust him again, and that's no foundation for a marriage. I'm torn. I do still love him, and I know he loves me and our son. But part of me wonders if I'll ever get over this. Was it just a moment of weakness on his part or a sign of something deeper that I can't overlook? So am I the a-hole for leaving him at the hospital and now considering leaving him for good? Not to be the corny, like, everyone makes mistakes type beat, but like, it is true. Like, humans do make mistakes and they're not always doing the right things. However, I am just massively suspect about his behavior. I think before OP even decides what they should do, they need to figure out like what the hell was up with him, because it doesn't just feel like he's panicking. Like, it feels like he's hiding something here. It's giving he's cheating. Before OP even considers staying with him and trying to rebuild that trust, I think OP needs to figure out if Jake was actually where he said he was. Because if I had to put money on it, my answer to that would be no. And then your answer is very easy. If that's not the case and he wasn't cheating and he was just being a terrible person, I think this is something you can work through. Like, you got married to this person, you're with them for all their like good traits, and you're also with them for their flaws. This man's flaw happened to be that he just had this like panic mode when this happened, which, don't get me wrong, is still very wrong, but I think you can recover from that. You're always going to get let down at some point by your partner. Like, there's never going to be a partner who perfectly never lets you down at any moment. When you marry them, I think you're basically saying like, we're going to work through them. And I just think the unforgivable ones are when you cheat on them or something like that. That's totally different. I very much think he cheated on her while she was birthing their child. That's how I feel, Sammy.